nobody's
funding
found him yet. But maybe he will come, but we can start off with Martin. So Martin is from the East Midlands in England. He works for the East Midlands community.
So
and his
I'm
presentation
feeling like
will be
walking
on can the sustainability
or
of co-housing
kind of like
in the UK.
I see myself as an edge worker, living in
looking at
myself,
recent developments for co-housing
working
proposals and projects in the UK.
On the other side,
so I'm going to hand over to you now, Martin.
Trying to figure out,
and I'll let you know if your presentation is going to appear up on the screen in the room here.
I'm just
and this is also what I'm
to the
about
chat that's going on. There's another voice that's somehow intruding into the recording.
Using
that's our room technician,
art-based expressions, dialogue,
all the time that you were talking, Vincent,
and all the damn good shit.
It's happening now.
So Martin, if you could share your screen with us, because we can't see your screen yet.
Next slide.
Is there any way not to hear the room technician, because that makes it two voices? And well, basically,
we have your screen now. Yeah, your screen is up, and we can see some of the participants on the Zoom meeting. Okay. So I'll just ask the room tech. Are we ready to go then? Okay. So Martin, your screen is, your presentation has been shared with us, so you can start whenever you want, yeah?
And you can hear my voice?
Yes, it's perfect, yeah.
Okay, this occasional other voice just creeping in, but let's see how we can go. So, morning, everyone. Initial apologies. I really wanted to be in Denmark for the conference. I lived in Denmark in the 80s. It's where I first got to know about co-housing schemes. And I'd fully intended to be able to come this time, and other things got in the way. So I do hope it's a great session for everybody. It's very interesting hearing the first plenary, a couple of key points being made by some of the speakers that resonate in.
Interrupt you for one moment. Thaisa has something here she needs to say.
All these social structures that does not make a good community.
I can hear you, Thaisa. I can hear this other voice as well.
Nice.
Therefore, I
it's
focus
just because
on what
we
I'm
see
calling
you
inner
in a
attitudes.
very small window.
So I wonder, like, what is
Zoom,
the way
so I
how
would ask you to stop sharing your screen just for a sec.
How can we design research
and then
that
we can
really tap
spotlight you? If you make me co-host, please. Okay, now we can see you. So I would ask you to please introduce yourself again, so we all can see you well.
Identifying common attitudes that are supportive to community.
Thank you.
And second, exploring creative research methods that center the real needs.
Now we can see you and hear you well, I guess.
And with this two ideas,
I don't know where the other.
It's another presentation, I think.
Martin, it's Marquis. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Basically, in order not to hear the other voice, because I'm assuming that's not happening in Denmark on site, I have to mute the microphones of the people in on site.
Yeah.
So whenever they want to speak, we're going to hear that voice, I'm assuming. And whenever they're not speaking, I will mute them. So hopefully it will all work out.
Okay.
Okay.
I think I'm with you. That's great. Okay.
I found a way to mute them anyway. So we'll see what happens.
Bless you.
Okay.
All right. Right. So, so I think Thaisa said just to say hello again. So I'm Martin Field from the UK. this is a talk about co-housing, and it's going to resonate with a number of things that were said from the introductory plenary. I work for an organisation, a not-for-profit organisation in the East Midlands in the UK that supports all kinds of community-led housing and neighbourhood initiatives. That's my contact details. There's a small video that we produced recently about our work, and some interviews with a couple of projects that we work with. We work with cooperatives, we work with community land trusts, we work with co-housing projects and other initiatives. In talking about co-housing today, I suppose, as I said, I used to live in Denmark in the 80s and started knowing about co-housing then, and have looked and talked about it and promoted it and worked with projects for quite some time, looked at it academically. And what I'm going to draw from is from a range of things that I've been, certainly publications I've been producing over the last 20 years, along with other colleagues. First one was nearly 20 years ago, thinking about co-housing. And then with Diggers and Dreamers editing, helping to edit Co-Housing in Britain, which was almost 10 years ago, and there's going to, just over 10 years ago, and there's going to be another volume that's being produced now, due to be released by Diggers and Dreamers next year. And then 2 years ago, a book that was setting the context for the community-led housing sector in the UK, talking about what makes different models of community initiatives different one from the other, and what's the similarities. So there's a chapter in there about land trusts, one about self-build, one about housing co-ops, chapter about co-housing, and at the same time also producing 2 key guides for the UK co-housing network, a practical guide for co-housing, and then this other guide about co-housing design. In the end, the practical guide to co-housing is nearly 200 pages. And it was as much an introduction to co-housing in a UK setting as it is in terms of practical points. I'd be quite honest and say it's not as good as an introduction to co-housing as something like Chuck Durrett's and Katie McDermott's books from America, but they don't really easily apply to UK settings. And so that practical guide was very much focused upon what do people have to do to try and get co-housing projects created successfully in the future in the UK. Just move that out of the way. What this talk's going to be about is what seems to be, to my mind at the very least, emerging constraints about where co-housing is going in the future. This is a very live discussion at the minute in different co-housing circles in the UK, and in particular to do with bodies interested in communal living, interested in co-housing living, but maybe saying, well, can't we just take different tacks on producing co-housing schemes in the future? Do we have to involve particular elements? Can we look at it in different approaches? And to what extent is that useful for co-housing? And in what extent is that really supportive of what local people are looking for or not? So I'm going to look at what's understood as essential to co-housing. I'm going to look at a little bit of where that relates to what are called co-housing's fragile position to the UK mainstream and the UK property market. What seems to be happening from current projects that will relate, as I see it, to co-housing's future, and whether or not it remains sustainable and achievable in the UK, and then a few thoughts for the future. And I'm very conscious that in a sense this is quasi-academic but largely practitioner-based. There are better academics than me that can talk about community initiatives and whatever. Sometimes some of that discussion seems to me to leave out practitioners' experience and co-housing residents' real experience of what's important and crucial to co-housing. And I suppose this presentation is trying to address that issue in particular, and not leave it at an academic level, but actually look at the very practical consequences of what's happening. So as I said in my original book back in nearly 20 years ago, co-housing is a clear intent to create intentional neighbourhoods, a very shared mutual intent to create a different sort of supportive neighbourhood, completely resident-led, completely managed. We're not going to talk about ownership or tenures in this talk in particular. It's about who controls the neighbourhoods that's being pulled together, deliberately designed to maximise incidental and organised contacts between the people living in that area. Quite deliberate. And there was talk earlier about the early origins of co-housing principles in Denmark, about vehicles kept to the edges of sites, maximising space for communal interaction, absolutely crucial in the design of such places. Self-contained accommodation, not shared accommodation, but privately self-contained across the neighbourhood, with a very key role given to a common house and other shared spaces or facilities that can all augment people living privately but living communally and sharing things together. And that such neighbourhoods have a scale that underpins the dynamics that clearly successful communities demonstrate in Denmark and America. The Danes originally had said, the original co-housing book in English talked about the Danish experience of between 12 and 40 adults plus children. And I'm mindful that Dara and McCammett have lately said 20 to 50, just slightly tweak that a bit, but it's still talking about minimums and maximums in order to sustain very direct, meaningful interpersonal relationships, not too large a number that's too remote, and not too small a number that it's too intensely personal between just a small number. Based on that set of principles, and those are the principles that for quite a lot of years, I know people have wanted to establish projects in the UK based very squarely upon those core principles, all of them wrapped into projects together, not just one or the other, but all of them together. There's some really successful examples that you can see in England. One of these is Spring Hill in Stroud. I'm only going to show a couple of slides of each of these schemes to economize on time. If you like, it's a slightly circularized setting, new build in the edge of a town centre. Originally, the town was resistant to the idea of a mutual scheme being plonked almost as it saw it close to the centre of town. It is so successful since it started integrating into community life. People would struggle to believe the resistance was ever there. Next one, Forge Bank in Lancaster, and I know there's a couple of colleagues from Forge Bank who are linked in remotely to this. Very long linear site along the banks of a river, absolutely picturesque setting along the river there, with a co-housing, a common house in the middle of it. Lilac, a low impact community in Leeds, again a very circular layout with the common house and common spaces in the middle. New Ground in Barnet. This is the first scheme, senior co-housing scheme in the UK for women 50 plus. If you like, two facades of properties with communal gardens, 2 lots of community gardens behind. I was here a couple of weeks ago. This is so lush now. This was the looking how the scheme looked a couple of years ago, soon after it opened. It is so lush now. There is such a lot of verdant overgrowth. It is really, truly impressive. And then the most recent scheme, Colchester in Essex, again a scheme principally for people 50 plus, but mixed tenure. Mixed gender, and again a linear scheme, upper sloping site. But what it used, the grey building on the map, is an old timber frame mill, which is where it gets the name of the site, and that's been turned into the common house. It looks very North American or Scandinavian because of its timber frame and timber aesthetics. But Co-housing's position in the UK market is so at odds with the focus of the mainstream market. And for people who are not familiar with the UK property market, just try to summarize just a couple of brief points. Less than 8% of any dwellings being created absolutely every year are self-commissioned. And the majority of those, almost all of those, are single household plots. It is extremely seldom that group schemes are able to get the sites to do new schemes such as co-housing neighbourhoods. And most residential areas still explicitly focus on being private for the individual nuclear households that hopefully are going to live there when principally they're sold for occupation, because most new build areas are still in the main for market sale occupations. The concept of community in any of these new build areas is invariably steered by traditional and fashionable practice of urban designers and private developers, rather than by any overt planning frameworks or planning principles or community-led principles. So it's always about trying to see if there is sympathetic development interest that would allow a community-led approach to be part of a wider development, or whether the market-led proposers already feel their take on community life and community approaches seems to be the only ones they want to support. And because of that, what you could say is there's not a positive value in any of the policy settings to creating opportunities for mutual facilities to be shared on a domestic scale. The nod is at very, very macro levels. So when people think about common houses in co-housing neighbourhoods, in the UK, that tends to only resonate with people's ideas about community centres for a much, much wider catchment area, you know, for some hundreds and hundreds of people to come to for an odd occasion, for almost a suburban get-together on a suburban scale. What that means is, as co-housing is often received, it's criticised for being exclusive and self-selective. And because a number of the schemes, certainly some of the ones that I highlighted, a number of those have not been able to be incorporating less expensive or affordable units. Co-housing is simply seen as expensive. It's simply seen as, and criticised as being exclusively expensive. And as a model approach, it's not seen as compatible with helping to deliver social housing or affordable housing in the main, even within the community housing sector, where colleagues of mine in other support agencies are very focused on affordable housing. They're sceptical about co-housing being able to be part of their the models they would like to support, because their introduction to it has seemed to be as if it's more exclusive and expensive rather than flexible and able to incorporate different sorts of units. My take is the neighbourhoods, the units in the neighbourhoods can be a whole variety of tenures. You need to think about that when you set it up, and there are a couple of examples of where that's happened. I could think of one down in Dorset in properties that were developed from a farm and associated holiday lets that were refashioned into mixed tenure co-housing, and it incorporated shared ownership tenures and rental tenures in partnership with a sympathetic housing association at the time that's fallen away, unfortunately, and a scheme that's just finishing on site now in Leeds, Chaco, which has a range of tenures, and again some of those will be rental in partnership with a very supportive housing association there. But in the main, it's not seen as a model that can help deliver social housing units, unfortunately. And there is a general mindset that somehow the notion of co-housing must be broader than the principles I set out at the beginning, that somehow it's about generally doing housing together, generally doing something shared or of a mutual benefit, rather than anything more precise, and certainly not something that's a precise approach to neighbourhoods per se. And a take on that, and it resonates with what in particular I think Camilla was saying about market bodies wanting to move into occupying space to deliver new mutual living arrangements. Some of those are definitely not supportive of projects that will include all the essential elements I'm highlighting here. And a further criticism that comes in from more community-minded approaches to co-housing, that if co-housing involves things in common with between the residents in somehow shared or operated communally, that ought to be available to everybody in a wider locality, not solely to the co-housing neighbourhood residents. Somehow there's a moral imperative that the co-housing project, when it's created something communal, automatically must open that up to a wider clientele. The consequence of that, and that's really the nub of this presentation, I suppose, is that if you look at then what's happening with schemes that are still classing themselves or calling themselves co-housing, you're beginning to see more schemes arrive and appear still calling themselves co-housing that don't conform or adhere to that set of principles I highlighted. Some schemes are coming forward with no common house. There's a couple in particular that seem to both have had housing association support, but somehow, even though they've been large schemes, they've not been able to build common houses. And there's some big questions to ask about how can that really be the case, because there would be money in the schemes to provide for common house, or there could be money that the schemes would have been able to acquire within the dynamics of the development economics to provide for common houses. But they've not appeared while they're still calling themselves co-housing. And there's questions to ask about who fundamentally steered through the projects, whether it's the residents and the members of the community, or whether it was partners becoming more and more dominant. To the credit of one of the schemes, the residents have subsequently obtained money through crowdfunding to deal with the common house expenses, and that's going to be the next stage to complete their overall initial ambitions. But what it feels to my mind is it's a worry if people can be saying we've done a co-housing scheme, but we couldn't provide a common house, and we think it's okay as it is. Higher, larger schemes being created. So what I said about the practical experience of schemes having minimum and maximum numbers to maximize the opportunity for the community dynamics and the community relationships, certainly not being evidenced in schemes that are almost double the size of what's recommended. There's one particular scheme for 80 adults. The site could easily have accommodated 2 co-housing schemes, and co-housing schemes side by side are not anathema to experience elsewhere, and you can clearly find examples of that in Scandinavia. But here it's almost as if one site, one area that could be designated for use must automatically come as a single scheme, regardless of some of these other parameters being overstretched. Design aspects in some of these schemes are still incorporating things like private car use and private entrances to maximize the executiveness of some of these areas, rather than the communalness and the encouragement for that incidental contact that has made co-housing schemes so attractive elsewhere. And because of the way that the property market works in England and the way that different monies are sought or believed to be necessary to find, some of that has come from bodies that want to have more stake in demanding who actually comes to live in them, and how things are managed by ostensibly people owning units rather than people renting them. And again, there's one scheme that's been created recently where there are people who have bought more than one unit and rented the other ones out. But the arrangement is that the renters don't have the same voting rights or opportunities to participate in the residents' democracy as the owners. And again, that seems so at odds with what co-housing had been set up to do as a more equitable basis of residence between one another. And schemes are being put forward prior to the identification of any residents, with parameters set by others for what subsequently happens. The high-profile scheme that was being originally had been the result of the local authority having been wooed for years and years by a local group to try and support a co-housing scheme to go ahead. When the local authority finally allocated land for a whole range of urban extensions and urban neighbourhoods, and decided it could support a co-housing neighbourhood, then decided that they didn't need to have affordable housing in it. And the local authority could sell the site for a market sale co-housing scheme, not least to maximise the receipts that the local authority would get for its own land. And it just has reinforced that sense in which co-housing examples are too exclusive and too expensive for others to participate in. So what I'd say the consequences of that is co-housing, the clarity of what co-housing has stood for in the past, and the clarity of how it emerged and its founding principles and values get to be too confused by these other comparisons with legitimate collaborative initiatives, but that are just muddying the preciseness in which co-housing can be seen to be distinct from them and distinct from commercial, the approach of commercial competitors. Partly that exposes the sorts of ways in which the groups themselves, the co-housing projects at the original core of things, often don't have the skills to manage the demands posed by the people they think need to be their external partners. That can be addressed. That can be addressed through the agencies of the kind that I work for, who can have a much more advocative and challenging role to challenge the undue demands that external partners can make. But it's about, it isn't in the first instance about groups understanding that they can do with that support to make sure that external partners aren't overbearing. In some of the schemes that I've already mentioned, as I've said, there's a clear weakening of resident-led controls and of across-the-board democratic accountability to the decisions being made in the development stages and decisions being made and practices of when communities have moved in. And the consequence of large scale, you would think, will continue to mitigate against creating in-depth relationships between the residents of neighbourhoods. If the scale that people have pointed to for years makes sense, then creating larger and larger schemes, you would think must weaken the opportunity for those kinds of relationships to develop as people had ideally initially wanted. The last thing I'd point to is that while there's some small notion in public policies about community-led housing, although it's very, very patchy, and it's by no means biting from the role of local authorities and local planning bodies to try and stipulate that community-led housing can take place in any of the UK regions. There's even less absence about people shaping their own neighbourhoods. And you could argue sometimes the word co-housing in English, unfortunately, in this instance, focuses almost upon people's notions of individual properties rather than focusing on the neighbourhood approach that clearly co-housing has always been part of. What I'd say is, are some thoughts about addressing some of these issues, is that the UK co-housing network takes a really stronger lead on stipulating what is core and essential to co-housing neighbourhoods. And that's not an easy pill for the network to swallow, because it's very conscious that it's approached by bodies saying, yeah, we might be able to support co-housing to some degree, but it might have to look like X, Y, or Z rather than A, B, C. And does that mean actually that co-housing's core identity gets subsumed by other commercial variants? The practical guide that I said our body was engaged to produce recently does include a basis of a skills development program for more extensive project management. And it would be really good for more groups to recognise how to make use of project management skills that are within the community-led sector now, and how it can then apply to getting out of co-housing projects all of the outcomes that they've originally, their ambitions and intentions brought them to it. The practical guide in the first instance was just online for members of the UK Co-housing Network, and it was designed to be an interactive PDF, and that works very well. But it's also being printed now, and the printed version should be available in about a month's time. It's interesting to still hear many projects hoping that they could get some land for co-housing projects from the local authority or from public bodies. Increasingly, I think that's unlikely to happen because the pressures on local authorities to either maximise receipts on the open market for land or to only designate land for the maximum delivery of affordable housing, especially rented housing, may mitigate against any of that being available for co-housing groups that simply want to do a mixed tenure kind of approach for a variety of households that have come together for common intent. In which case, the source of land increasingly needs to focus them on large development bodies who have access or options themselves on land for large scale area developments around the edges of towns or cities, within which projects could try and see what's the opportunity to themselves get an option to build an innovative co-housing based neighbourhood within a larger area, and if you like, demonstrate the quality of their approach, which can rub off on a supportive developer, getting kudos from the community-led outcomes. And a number of the schemes I mentioned earlier are award-winning, even the ones that were originally met with resistance by local authorities who were very uncertain about what co-housing represented. You know, the history of them has been more than one project gaining national and international design and community awards. To try and mitigate against projects recognising that they need development agency support to help bring about professional expertise and skills and work and monies and the construction phase and everything. that in the past have turned to the private sector or even to the housing association sector and found them wanting, there's still a role for the community-led housing sector as a whole to develop its own development agency, maybe at a national level, that can be the route to providing more of those resources to make schemes successful. And there needs to be increased engagement with policymakers to be aware of what community-led neighbourhoods have meant in practice and the successes they've brought to their projects. And they're not just simply housing ones that can leave policymakers lacking an appreciation of the scale of what communities have achieved themselves. So that's the end. So
thank you very much, Martin. That was a very comprehensive overview of co-housing in the UK, and it was very nice how you shared with us some of the examples, but then you went into quite a lot of detail of the challenges facing co-housing. So what I'm going to do now is open up here to the room to see if people have any questions, and after that then we can see if any people who are on remotely through Zoom, if they have questions. Now I would ask people to have very specific questions for Martin, because he came with quite a lot of detail, and we should really, ask questions to him, yeah?
Hi, Martin. This is Steve Lloyd-Moffat from California. Thanks for your presentation. It seems like you're in a great position in your role to have a natural experiment into which regulatory agencies shifted when and what led them to embrace co-housing, if the general assumption is they seem to be opposed to it. And so I'm wondering what strategies you've noticed seem to have worked over time, which ones don't, what have regulatory agencies cared about in your experience, which ones shift and why in your experience?
I have to say I'm very torn about the experience of regulatory authorities in the UK, because, and I've worked inside the public sector, I've worked inside regional bodies, regional policy-making bodies, and I'm a definite believer that there's such an opportunity for sympathetic and supportive bodies to make things easier for community projects on the ground. And if you put policies in place, it's so much easier for officers inside some of the local bodies to know and be steered by what they can see policy supports them doing. Too often, unfortunately, individual officers think they have to almost surreptitiously support a project behind the scenes because there doesn't seem to be an overt policy promoting community initiatives. And then even if that turns out to be reasonably successful, it's not highlighted. It's just a one-off, and people don't learn enough from the experience, and they don't learn, they don't incorporate their learning into policy focused change in the future. One of my takes on the regulatory role is it reflects, I suppose, wider values, wider social and community values. And that comes with a health warning of what I'm going to say next, which is because in the UK, property and housing services are so top down, and they are so regimented along the lines of people providing for others. There is an increasing skepticism developed over the years in different phases, I have to say, against supporting people to do it for themselves, unless you happen to have the money whereby you can just do it, go off and do it by yourself like an individual self-builder. And that's just seen, well, you've got the opportunity to do that, so you can just carry on. When people are saying we want to do this ourselves together, intentionally, mutually, it meets such such uncertainty to a lot and overt skepticism, if not resistance, in other places. And so an example of that is a community land trust that's recently formed in the middle of England. And it thinks it's got the first site for its first scheme of about 10 or 12 rented properties. It's been at it for about 12 years just to get to that stage. And now in just about getting to the stage of where it can put a scheme forward for planning approval, not as any special scheme, but just as a bog standard residential development for planning approval. The officer's saying, we never thought you'd get there. And my thoughts on that is that what you would say to a private developer? Would you say to a private developer, we never thought you were good enough or competent enough to do that? So I'm sort of answering your question about regulatory support in a roundabout fashion, because it seems to me there's perfectly good routes to take for regulatory support to be more evident and more biting, but it doesn't happen yet enough.
Okay, thank you. So I have another question here from Neil.
Hello, Martin. Thank you for your presentation. Well, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Co-housing is also about culture.
Yeah.
And, you know, in Denmark, we have all these eco villages. So my question to you is, what about, for example, have you a common garden in your co-housing? What do you do with your waste? Have you any kind of culture about your waste? And what about all your computers? Have you your own agreements from person to person, or is it so that you have organized a system for in common for all your computers? You see, about culture, how far are you in these areas? And another question is about cooperatives. Have you any cooperatives in your area for co-housing? Thank you.
I'll answer the second question, the second point first, in as much as the nature of the democratic accountability of co-housing principles seems to be as much cooperative as something that might be called a cooperative. And there are certainly colleagues of mine that in the cooperative housing part of the community-led sector in the UK who would say, yeah, well, co-housing is a cooperative. It just happens to usually be involve a bit more property ownership tenure than simply rented ones. But just because housing cooperatives in the UK have evolved into principally an idea of where it's rented housing, although all of the properties are actually owned by the group of members, it would be a bit odd to actually separate cooperative natures as something that doesn't happen within co-housing projects, because clearly the democratic egalitarianness of them is a very similar approach. It's just in a UK tenure setting, they've turned out to be very distinct kinds of tenure outcomes. Years ago, when I was the head of one of the main UK co-op development bodies, and I were on a working group that was helping try and set the policy together for the older women's co-housing schemes that I mentioned as one of my examples. And he was always candid to say, well, yeah, co-housing is just a good housing co-op. And he mentioned one in South London, for example. And I thought, okay, let's, and I was living in a housing co-op at the time. I was chair of a housing co-op, a housing co-op with 100 units. And I said, let's find out what he's saying about this other particular housing cooperative. And I tracked down a contact in South London. He said the co-op doesn't exist anymore. He said, we had wonderful common facilities, gardens and shared facilities, and we didn't have private space. We had to still share kitchens and bathrooms, and it was too intense. And it brought about a rupture in the community relationships because people wanted private accommodation alongside those shared facilities. And that seems to be the real distinction between in the UK cooperatives and co-housing things, not the co-op principles, but the range of facilities of one being either a shared house or individual houses with no shared facilities on top of that, or else the co-housing ones. But in terms of your earlier point about waste and computer stuff, I'm not in a co-housing setting at the minute. I can see at least one of the members of one of the co-housing projects I've mentioned, who used to be on the board of ICSA, is in the virtual audience. And what I'd say about things to do with dealing with ecological issues, to do with waste, maybe even to do with how communities use computer setups, seems to be quite idiosyncratic at the minute. But increasingly, the projects that we work with who come to us with co-housing ideas and ideals want to incorporate really, really strict eco-centered practices at the same time. So they want to add the eco-ness to those set of principles that I mentioned, you know, so they want to make co-housing sustainable also in all of those eco-practical fashions.
Okay, thank you, Martin. We'll take another question from the room here in Denmark, and then we'll go over to the Zoom participants to see if they have any questions. So I'll pass the mic to Anton.
Thank you. Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. My name is Anton. Thank you for your presentation. Sobering, I guess would how would describe it. And I wanted to clarify a couple of things. I hear and I see that the ideas of we work and we live and the rise of real estate players trying to cash in on community. And I guess that reflects, if I understand correctly, what you're saying is that there are developments, co-housing developments that are not bottom up, but top down, that our developers are selling units and selling it as, you know, something trendy and something, and rather than the bottom up. And I'm wondering if I understand what you're saying correctly, is that there's more and more of that and less of people coming together and saying, we want to live together and build this project together because we believe in the ideas of co-housing. That's my first question. And my second question is, it's clear to me from what you're saying that there's a very, very tiny number of people that are coming together at the beginning of the road and saying, we want to build this project for ourselves to live in. And it sounds almost impossible to get from that point of having that idea to getting to the point where they're moving in. So it's already a small number to start with. And then that difficult bureaucratic, financial, legal process of getting to the point where they're building their community sounds next to impossible. And you sort of point out roles of different bodies that can help them along the way. And I'm wondering if there could be a more unified umbrella or address to enable the very small number of people to get down that path to realize their vision of living in community. And you mentioned the co-housing network, and you mentioned policymakers, and you mentioned, and I'm wondering if that process is a thought about streamlining that process so that the people that are trying to set up these communities have one address where they can gain experience and knowledge from a central body that has been through this process with groups in the past, rather than being something spread out.
Yeah. Because people, in my experience, because people come to co-housing ideas from a range of backgrounds, it takes a time to see whether or not what they think is co-housing or what they want for themselves resonates with enough other people to want to do that and carry on doing that together. So it's in terms of thinking about a single point of contact, a single reference place that they can be directed towards. It can work through the UK co-housing network. The UK co-housing network is a quarter of one recent amalgamation or collective approach within the community housing sector that's tried to do that for community-led ideas in general and farm people out to different sorts of, depending on their aspirations, whether aspirations is really for co-op living or whether it's for something like a land trust, helping local members of the community, not so much helping to house themselves, or whether it's a co-housing, live in it yourself type approach. There are some attempts to try and collect and capture people's interest and signpost them. It's really difficult to be able to work that back to there only ever being one body, if you like. In terms of small numbers of people, and it sounded like it's almost impossible, I think that's always a danger in pointing out any of the drawbacks of what's going on, that it can only come across as something that's almost too impossible to continue. And while there aren't that many, I have to say, it doesn't feel like there's that many recent examples of co-housing that's happened in the UK. There are some more. They come forward in steady dribs and drabs. It's not as if it never happens at all. And each one adds to the reference group that people can see, here's how it helped, and here's a particular means whereby this group was able to realize its stuff in practice.
Thanks, Martin. Don't get me wrong, I'm all for doing the impossible.
Yeah. Yeah, me too. And I don't want to make it sound like it's impossible. The biggest hurdle is just finding a site. The other bits and pieces are almost more straightforward. There's frameworks, you know, to bring the money about. There's frameworks to engage with the professionals. You know, there's good design competence out there that projects can manage to get the design outcomes they're looking for. All of that perfectly doable, as more and more projects do demonstrate. You know, the one recently in Cannock Mill, or the one that's just finishing in Leeds. It's the sites that make the difference, and whether or not they come with strings attached. So people, for example, think if they partner up with a housing association, the housing association sector has access to land and its own networks, you know, to get sites, and therefore it can be sympathetic and supportive of a co-housing outcome. And it's possible. What I'm pointing to is, in practice, there are such strings attached to what then the housing association wants for itself, out of something it thinks is the kind of development it wants. You know, I was working with a scheme in the Nottingham, Derbyshire area until recently, who had been knocked back so many times trying to find a site that when I finally was put in touch with them, they were saying, well, we need to go with this housing association. It's our last shot, because if we can't do this, we've been at this for so many years, we're going to quit. So we need to go with this housing association. And I met the housing association and was not impressed, I have to say. And I've worked in housing associations, been an investment manager for, you know, public funds to help housing associations develop. I wasn't impressed with whether they really understood democratic control. And subsequently, the site that they identified that they had, as a housing association, a formal legal option to obtain, excluded the co-housing group. The group had no purchase on that site in which it was putting such faith. And it actually put its own money in through public grant to do design work to get the planning application completed and submitted for a site they didn't have access to. And subsequently, the housing association signed up to an horrendously expensive price, which it should never have done, because it should have been subject to development appraisal economics, and then pulled out of the scheme anyway and said to the co-housing group, we're no longer interested in doing this. And the group stopped. The group didn't proceed any further.
It's not a very positive picture that you're painting, Martin. You know, like it's sort of like I live in Northern Ireland. I don't think we have a co-housing scheme in Northern Ireland. A few people were interested in setting up one, but from what you say, it sort of just puts people off, you know. But you know, like I would say, you know, I really sort of admire what you're doing with the network, that at least there is a body of people who, you know, you can go and talk to for advice. Yeah.
I think the only answer I've got to that is a general one, in terms of if there are issues that need to be spelt out, that need to be named for what they are, can naming it at least then help to find a way through it and stop it becoming a persistent problem? You know, sometimes it's about challenging people's sense in which they think they've come to an immovable position, and need to be open to other advice about how to proceed in a different direction or a different manner. A group that came to the network a while ago from Northern Ireland was looking at a scheme. It was conscious that in the UK mainland, a number of co-housing schemes use a formal property tenure called leasehold basis. So the group owns the site, but individuals may be owning property on a leasehold basis, maybe 999 years. And that seems to not exist in Northern Ireland. And they were looking at maybe then setting up to enable people to come maybe with more modest resources, setting up a scheme where half the co-houses would own all of the units, but rent half of them to people who would be rental members. And there would be I'd suggest there'd be severe democratic issues about voting in that sort of circumstance. And I said to them, well, did you think about setting up a company that could be controlled by all of your members, but the company provided the rental housing rather than the individuals owning everything? And they'd gone to some national solicitors to ask for advice on setting up a new framework where 50% of the people owned 100% of the units. And it just seemed a bit odd that they'd come to co-housing with that framework in their minds rather than kicking around other ideas. There are other ideas. People sometimes feels like people take some cul-de-sacs.
Okay, so I'm going to pass on now to people in the Zoom room, and then I'll come back to the participants here. So no, there's only one speaker. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So is there any people in the Zoom rooms who would like to ask questions? I'm surprised. Chris, have you not got a question?
I'm in regular touch with Martin. I don't need to ask him any questions.
All right. So you bounce your questions off each other, I presume, Chris, do you? Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Chris was one of the other main contributors to the guide that I've mentioned a couple of times.
Okay. So, yeah, Debbie?
Hello, I'm Betsy Morris. I'm part of the Cohousing Research Network. I live in Berkeley Cohousing in California. I've been on the board of FIC and a researcher into some of FIC's, the Fellowship for Intentional Community. And I'm now a GEN ambassador and maybe a GENA council member. They're scraping the bottom of the barrel. I'm sorry, we're not very organized as eco-villages in the US. So my observation, so first, thank you deeply. I got to visit my first UK co-housing, Spring Hill, and met the founder and a number of very generous neighbors there in Stroud. So my observation around your saying it's sites, getting land. Another avenue for growth that I've seen has been in the US, that over time, the intentional communities and a certain number of cooperatives have actually adopted some co-housing principles. So a land co-op builds, where everyone has their own house, builds a common house after 25, 30, 40 years. And a cooperative gets re-energized with members who are like, hey, let's be kind to each other, you know, and if possible, add common space. Sometimes that's not possible. Or let's move to a more consensus or sociocratic method rather than a straight democracy. I'm curious if you've seen similar trends. Another trend is that at this point, about a third, up to a third of the intentional communities that have been established and represented in the directory use a land trust model, have their own land trust, and another third, the land is owned by some external, apparently external land trust of some kind. So the move, these common moves, these solutions that groups have adopted over time to sustain themselves, I mean, we could talk about the ecological efforts too, but these are the social and legal. I wonder if you're seeing, or there's potential for that in England with all the different types of intentional communities and cooperatives, where there's an interest to become, you know, convergences, not to become co-housing or call themselves that, but convergences of governance methods, convergences of land tenure, convergences of adding common facilities as well as private space, if it's all communal. Thank you. Any opportunities to grow from what exists already? It's my question.
I think what you do see at the moment is a number of projects that are small in start, but gradually begin to increase their number and then see the ability to have the monies pooling the finances and resources to actually put in place more of the common and shared facilities. So there's a project in Sheffield that's done that recently, in buying an existing Victorian property and increasingly carving out some of that space for communal use and then adding to it with new build properties. Couple in Sheffield, to be honest, one in the urban centre and one close to the edge, which is about creating a more co-housing-esque intentional neighbourhood on a farm setting, and gradually changing the nature of some of the ex-farm buildings into residential and mutual facilities. So you can see that in some places. And one of the projects we're working with, it's explicitly wanting to have a co-housing outcome, but they've got an offer accepted on a large property that's a couple of 100 years old, which in the first instance will probably only allow them to, if they carry the purchase through, will only allow them to carve out about 5 or 6 units. But it comes with about 6 acres of land, a couple of other sets of outbuildings. And so there's the possibility, if they can get the right support, again, from regulatory bodies, there's the possibility of being able to gradually evolve into the co-housing ethos that they've wanted originally. As regards, what did you say? As regards other kinds of coalescence of ownership, land ownership, or things like that, there are the first signs of a couple of projects believing that maybe where there is a wider initial concern for holding land in common and keeping it in a vehicle like a land trust for perpetual community benefit, that nevertheless that could be the basis of a portion of a larger area being directed towards the co-housing neighbourhood. So there, for example, is a scheme in York where the land trust that's been set up is trying to get the resources for more than one kind of sub-project. One of those is a co-housing project that would lease part of the site from the land trust in terms that would still allow the democratic control by the co-housing members to operate a co-housing neighbourhood in that part. So you can begin to see some coming together of some of those principles. It comes with a health warning that people involved in the land trust, if they are the freeholder, doesn't subsequently think we've got to set some onerous conditions on how a co-housing sub-project utilises its opportunity to build on this part of our site and try and interfere with membership selection or resident selection or something like that. So I think you need to wait to see how those two kinds of organisations that don't necessarily come from the same starting point could work out in practice in partnership.
Thank you very much, Martin. I think that's all the questions now. So I would like to thank Martin for his wonderful presentation. I would also like to thank Marcus for his involvement in the session this morning, and Tyza and our room tech here in Denmark as well, and for also all the participants who've taken part either virtually or in person here in Denmark. So thank you very much, Martin. Okay.